Hi everyone, my name's Scott Hartley and I'm here with Hayley Lieber, Chief Executive of GM Moving, for the third of our conversations about creating the conditions for change. In the last two, we've covered making the case for change for why movement matters, and then we moved on to chatting about how we observe what might be changing in the work in the last one, I think. This time we're going to be chatting about what it requires from us as practitioners and leaders. Starting with sharing our experiences about what has influenced our thinking to work with the scale and complexity of the challenge that we're trying to tackle. Can you move us on, Hayley, to the next slide and just remind ourselves why we're here? I guess we're here to explore our experiences about why, how, and what it takes to try and create change in these two interrelated challenges of inequality and inactivity. So let's get into it, Hayley. Do you want to take over and share the next slide, please?
Okay, it's great to be back. Yes, so I thought it'd be helpful to start with a reminder of, as you've just done, about that this is about tackling inactivity and inequalities, and then to remind ourselves that we are working in very complex, large-scale change in kind of quite uncertain, moving conditions. And the reason I'm going to share this short animation is something we did a few years ago now, but it still feels really helpful to explain how we work in complex systems, because I think we do get lost sometimes in the language of, positive systems approaches and system change and all of the rest of it. So this was our attempt a few years ago, quite early on in the process, to try and explain that. And I think it conveys quite clearly why we know we need to work in a different kind of way when it comes to our sort of daily practice and the way we organise our work. So I'll press play and enjoy the film.
Greater Manchester Moving is a social movement designed to help people move more and enjoy a healthier and longer life as a result. If this was a simple problem, it would look like this. In reality, this isn't a simple problem. It's a complex problem. Real lives are unpredictable and influenced by hundreds of different factors. We may feel we have personal choice, but it is very much defined by the world around us. We are tied into a system of influences that expands throughout our friends, family, our workplace, any community groups we are part of, local government, national government, and even our culture. In a complex system, if one thing changes, everything else changes in response. For example, government policy directly affects us all, but it also shifts when enough of us want it to. Constant change means that something that worked well in Didsbury last year might not work in Glodwick, or even again in Didsbury, today. To transform a system this big, unpredictable, and messy, where do we even start? This is what we ask ourselves every day at GM Moving. And our answer is everywhere. For a solution to work locally, we need a deep understanding of that area's unique strengths and what can be done. Right here, right now, to get people moving. Decisions need to be made within the community that let local people take the lead on making active lives easier. But those in charge of large institutions also need to be on board, because for local change to happen, it must be supported by high-level strategic decisions. What we do is hard to measure. Rather than how small parts of the system are causing people to change, we want to know how the system is changing as a whole. Every day, Greater Manchester Moving advocates are working with town planners, large employers, and small community groups. Our role is to spark meaningful conversations in lots of places at once, to gently and slowly influence and recruit people at every level to use their own creativity and initiative to transform things for the better. To follow what works, wherever it leads. To share the excitement when something goes right, as well as support people to learn and try again when things go wrong. It will take patience and it will take time. But we believe that by doing things differently and accepting complexity, we can create changes that get real people moving in the real world. We believe in the power of Greater Manchester's people to make positive system change happen. That together we can design moving back into life. If you believe it too and you want to be part of it, visit www.gmmoving.co.uk today.
I haven't watched that for a while, actually. It's made me smile for a couple of reasons today. Because the conditions are changing, aren't they, all the time? And that's a really good example of that. And now I can't move on the slide. There we go. So, yeah, it's really made me smile, actually. But I'll hand back to you to kind of guide us from there.
Just an observation first on the video. One of the things that I was, really intrigued by, just how relationships, between people, between organizations, between those influences in the system kind of really comes out in it. It not maybe in an overt way, but in a really subtle way, which I think is really helpful. And I think we'll probably come back to that a little bit later. I guess what we're trying to introduce here is the two loops model, and that going back 7 years when we first started doing some work together in Greater Manchester, and some of the things that we observed about how the dominant system kept things in place and how challenging we found that to try and enable a different system to come from it, to emerge from it, and to start encourage us to think about, well, what does that take? What does that mean to the way that we work with our colleagues, with our partners, to actually start to get people thinking around, well, this system at the moment, the dominant system at the moment, is giving us inactivity, it's giving us inequality, it's giving us the relationship between those two things. So what do we need to start thinking about in order to be able to help a new system emerge? And I guess this diagram is a great way of thinking about that dominant system and that emergent system, and what we need to help do in the dominant system to be able to let that emergent system start to flourish. And I know it's, the diagram that we started with earlier is based on this, isn't it? Where you've connected inequality and inactivity. It reflects this concept of two loops, and you've got a lot of stories now in GM around what that emergent system needs to look like and the way that we need to act within it, which I think we'll get on to exploring.
And it's interesting because I remember when I first saw there's a video which we can link to, the Berkana Institute, the little video that kind of explains this diagram in a way that when I first saw it, it felt like being in therapy, because it was a time where I'd probably say we were at the kind of top of the top curve, and feeling like pioneers, needing to stabilise and hold air cover for the people who are doing the work. And I would say this is the case probably across the whole of the Greater Manchester kind of public service reform and health transformation process, as well as then GM Moving as a kind of microcosm of all of that in practice, in action. That is one thing, isn't it, saying sort of, right, we're going to do things differently, we're going on this journey to transformation and reform as pioneers, and then when you're on the top of that curve and things, you're recognising that some things do need to die off and be dismantled and, got rid of, or, then that becomes the hard bit, because that's the process of change, of letting go and recognising that some things have to go. And we'll get on to kind of the personal leadership journey in this a bit later, but recognising the different roles that we play and who plays the different roles, like who are the pioneers, and then who are the kind of, and Yvonne Harrison and I talk about this quite a lot, because she was the pioneer, she was the creative, innovative, sticking her head above the parapet early in the early part of this journey, and then she recognises the need for people to come in and then stabilize and systematize the work. And we work together in that way and talk about that still. And that process of, you know, composting, hospicing and composting the best of what was, because we talk often about it's not that everything we've always done is wrong, it's just that it didn't create the change at scale that was needed to address those inequalities. So the reason that watching the video and explaining that as the new system emerges, the strength of that is in the networks on connecting all those and the relationships. You said the relationships between the pioneers and the stabilizers and the advocates and the champions and the practitioners, and that the beauty of it and the kind of great sense of hope and optimism I started to feel was when I realised that this is about there's learning in this that is reassuring, energising and optimistic when you realise that there's a totally different way of working, which is about letting go of control, which is about forming networks and relationships and nourishing community practice and helping things to spread and grow. When I think in the old system, you'd have been asked, what's the thing, what do we need to do and how do we scale it up? Whereas this realisation that it was about spreading and growing and nourishing in a more organic way was just brilliant. And I'd go back and watch the video whenever I was feeling a bit out of my comfort zone, you know, or struggling, because there is real struggle in that transition. And you're holding a lot of people and a lot of people are kind of following and you're thinking, wow, you feel you're in the grip because you're just holding all this tension while you wait for the evidence and the kind of evaluation stuff to start to give you some reassurance that it's possibly making a difference and it's worth pursuing.
Just listening to you then reminds me of your use in particular of the Dancing Man video. Can you remember that whole concept of someone's got to go first and just trust it if we're doing some things in the right way that some people will follow, however mad we might seem dancing in the field on our own. That pioneer element of this, and then seeing people come to it and connect with it and with relief. I can remember some of that early work, people saying, this is great, what we've been trying to do this for a while and it's great that we've got people putting their heads up to try and take this on now.
Yeah, I'm just really fortunate that Yvonne's really good at dancing in a field.
I think the important bit here for me is it can feel lonely, that can it? Even the hand on from Yvonne to you and others, it can feel like a very lonely space at the beginning, and not just at the beginning, in the early stages, especially when you're saying something that's quite different and trying to explore something that's quite different to the system that's dominant and the culture around that system that's really quite prevailing. And that can be a very lonely space. And I think it's quite important to acknowledge that, because I'm sure there'll be other people that probably feel like that in different parts of the country. Absolutely.
Yeah. Which is part of the motivation for doing this. It's like, we're not on our own. Okay, we'll move on. So to explain why this model became really, again, a sort of good therapy for me. And it's not that long ago, it's probably a couple of years ago, I was doing some work in an action learning group and we ended up using this quite a lot. And this was, again, much wider than GM Moving, more sort of right across the system in GM, in what's become the system shifting leadership program work in GM, which again is about, actually, the language you use is really important, isn't it? Because this helped me to see that we had to get underneath, not just we've talked before about all the influences on people moving and the fact that the culture change that's needed around ideology and worldview and assumptions and beliefs and values in terms of how we see movement and physical activity and what influences that. I think that this model did a similar thing for me when it came to our leadership practice and our behaviours and the way that we think about the work. So if we are trying to, if we've got a different goal or we're trying to change the outcome, and we know we need to work in a different way at the sort of above the line events, activities, visible stuff, we can tend to focus a lot of our efforts there in terms of what do we need to do differently, what do we need to, what are the events and the activities, and what is the work programme. And what this helped me to see is that if we don't get right underneath the surface and talk about and name the assumptions and beliefs and values that are underneath the way we all work. So I wrote a blog a few years ago about the alpha culture in the workplace as a really good example of that in practice of, and if we're not prepared to name the fact that I have certainly grown up in my career in a very alpha culture, and I don't mean by that in a gendered way. It's a set of behaviours and mindsets and ways of being and working that have held us back from the change that's needed. So if we're not honest about that, and if we don't address some of those things, then we're never going to get different events and activities and patterns and trends and structures. And we're never going to get the outcome of addressing inactivity and inequality. So this is another real light bulb for me in that, oh God, let's allow ourselves to talk about our assumptions, beliefs and values in this work, because it's really, really important if we want to change anything. Okay. And I guess that, that sort of feels like there's a line to draw between those two things, because this is the slide we talked about in the first video that we did about, what I was just saying there about in order to shift physical activity, we need to work in that layer. And in order to do that, we need to get way underneath the surface of our own beliefs about what leadership is and what kind of work we need to do and how we need to do it. This is, I'm going to come to you for this one, because this is, you've got a better way of describing this than I have, but I think this alongside a few of the other things that we'll share after, it was another like, oh, this really helps us to see the potential and the hope and optimism slides. These, I would call all of this little set. So I'll pass to you.
This came out of some conversations that we were having, weren't we, around how do we help people. How do we ourselves get our head around the value of relationships, and how do we help others see the importance that relational work is to the kind of change that we're trying to enable? And I stumbled across, through a little bit of reading, Metcalfe's law, which is it's done about telephones. This image is off, I think it's off Wikipedia or something like that. Of Metcalfe's law of the more nodes, the more telephones you add, the greater the number of connections that are potentially the exponential growth of connections there are between the number of telephones. Well, replace the telephones with people, and you've got exponential growth in what's possible, haven't you? Exponential growth in ideas, in possible solutions, in ways of working together, in all of those wonderful things that connecting people can bring. And so I think it helped us, didn't it? I think just start to articulate in a system that likes to see numbers, start to articulate this is why we need to do relationship building, because the more people, we've got a situation that's highly complex with an enormous amount of influences of what's holding inactivity and inequality in place. And the more people that we connect to that can find ideas, create different, opportunities and solutions to changing things in their areas of work, the more chance we have of influencing that outcome further down the line. And this, I think, has played a role in helping us just kind of articulate that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it sits really well alongside these slides, which I remember Tom Underwood from NHS Horizons first shared these in a meeting we were in a few years ago, and again it was like, oh, I'm grabbing that out of the Teams chat, and I've used these in my thinking a lot since. In a similar way to Metcalfe's law, it helps you to see the power of relationships and connections, and the importance of strong social ties and multiple strong social ties and bridges. And I can think back to the beginning of this work and me arriving in Greater Manchester in 2017 and feeling like the bottom right hand, a little bit like the bottom right hand diagram there, of which is weak, which is really weak, fragile, and overwhelming. Because if you're at the centre of multiple relationships into a system, so for example, when I first came and started working with the NHS teams, it became very quickly overwhelming, because what was lovely, and I said before, is that I'd meet one person and they introduced me to five more people, and this kind of growth happened very, very quickly, and all the doors were open, but it was very fragile, and I was holding a lot. And whereas if you compare that now to how our health team work with the health system in Greater Manchester, you'll see much more of the right hand diagram here, which is multiple overlapping connections, lots and lots of reinforcement. There aren't a small number of people holding a set of relationships, and people talk to and work with whoever they need to work with, and there's lots and lots of networks and communities of practice and different groups and collectives of different people in different parts of the system, because any system needs to organise itself somehow. But what's really important is that you have people who are like literally walking across the bridge all the time between these things, and that it's inclusive, and you keep noticing, you need to notice where the weak ties are, or where those networks aren't diverse enough, and you notice who's missing and who's not connected. And I think that also sat really well alongside the conversations we were having. And I saw this slide, Helen Bevan shared it at the Stronger People conference, Stronger Things conference, just before the pandemic. And it was another moment of, the potential of this is amazing, because if it felt like we'd engaged 3% of people in the Greater Manchester system on this mission of moving matters to everyone, the challenge around that time, beginning of 2020, was, well, it still feels like there's such a long way to go in terms of the scale. And this diagram and the work by Innovisor that sits underneath it really helped me to understand more about the ways of working to enable that change, from 3% red dots on that to 85% red dots on that. And we use this kind of, you can use this in a very practical way in terms of your sort of stakeholder mapping and things as well, is to identify who are those sort of influencers, spark plug, super connector people who, if you get them working in a particular way, which we'll get onto, they can really sort of fire up that diagram, and all of a sudden it's turning red all over the place. So I think that little sequence of visuals there has just helped us, both in terms of hope, optimism, and allaying anxieties, but also in a very, very practical way, because they kind of lead into us. So how do we do that, and what is the daily practice that enables that to happen as well?
And you touched on, I think, a really important word towards the end of your description there around hope. I think what's really powerful for me of this particular slide, of that set of 3 slides, really, is it gives some guidance of the kind of work that you need. Build wide bridges. It's how do you start to think about what that looks like in your work, and then B, this gives you hope, doesn't it? Because we know there are so many influences of the outcome, and you can be overawed by that. The evidence is suggesting to us, though, is if you start connecting up, and you start connecting up in the right way around the right things with that common understanding, then you don't have to reach as potentially many as people as you think you do, because the network will grow and do the work for you. The bottom right hand box of the revaluation model that we used in the last one, it'll grow itself, and it'll take the message forward. We can be in 2 places at once, can't we? As we've explored previously.
Absolutely, and we'll come on to this as well, but I was just thinking about this has already played out in my day so far, and what is it, it's only 10:15 or something, because and it goes back to the animation at the beginning, is one thing has changed in the system. There's a new government, and that sort of the diagram that shows like into GMCA, from national government into GM out into the whole system, it's literally happened in practice, in action, in the last sort of 24 hours. You can see it. And then it is about, and it hasn't, and change isn't happening, it's happening through both the formal structures and through the informal networks and relationships that exist. And that's where the exciting sort of moment is for me. And that speaks to that point, really, which is, this isn't either or, nothing's either or, is it? But this definitely isn't either or. And I love Julian Stodd's got some really lovely books and ways of animating this stuff that is that we work here in Greater Manchester in a very formal set of structures, because like I say, any system needs to organise itself somehow, and the governance of the Greater Manchester system and the way it operates at its best is a really powerful thing, you know, and a really important flow of strategy and decision making and change making. And at the same time, it doesn't do everything that we need it to do. And so the social structures and networks and relationships that are flowing all around of that, you could probably almost like overlay these things on top of each other rather than having them side by side. And you need to know, as leaders, we need to be able to operate in both ways. You know, it's never helpful to sort of criticize or, you know, reject the formal structures. You know, they play a really, really important part in democracy, you know. So it's interesting just to think about it in the context of that animation, and if enough people want change to happen, then there's a really structured way that democracy happens, isn't there? So there's a couple of slides here. I'll just toggle between them for a minute, because I think one of the things that Jeppe from Innovisor, we had a great call one day, and he was explaining to me from Denmark about that 3% to 85% and the research that he's done around that. And we talked about the research for a while, and then I kind of asked him a question about, you know, so if you can go from 3% to 85%, how do you do it? How do you organise your thinking in a way that really creates the conditions for that change to happen? And he drew in a little post-it note, this little 2x2, he called it a 2x2 grid, and he held it up to the Teams camera, and it had, and I've kind of filled in, as I was listening to him, I was kind of doodling to a piece of paper on my desk, these 4 quadrants, which is, if you think about everything that happens in the process of any kind of change, whether that's in your life and your family and your work, you can organise your thinking into processes that are quite structured and formal, processes that are very informal and unstructured, speaking back to that social network sort of type thinking. And we were just talking it through, like, well, so what are the ways of working and the practices that are at play in each of those quadrants? So I just loved the conversation, so I kind of captured it and then wrote a blog off the back of it, which we can share. And then at the end of the conversation, he said something really powerful, which is emotion is key. And he drew a heart in the middle of it. And it was basically, this conversation was about belief and an emotional connection, which we know because of what we'd shared in the previous video about helping people to understand and personally, emotionally connect to how moving matters to them and their work. And it's really important in the change process, because I think what we realise is that people need to believe that moving matters and believe they have a role to play in it. And they also need to believe in the process of change, you know, that sort of journey of change of that dominant system, emergent system. So this is helpful in a few different ways, really, to help us think, what do we actually need to do? Well, we need to find people, listening to them, ask them good questions, listen, build trust relationships, you know, turn them from outsiders into insiders. You know, some of these ways of describing a very different form of leadership, isn't it, to what we perhaps might have done in our early careers, is talk in the language of when there are new leadership in place. Well, we need to be banging on the door to sell, to make, you know, to sell them, and, you know, physical activity and why moving matters, and to, you know, and quite honestly, you know, years ago it would have been about how do we get money out of them to help us to do stuff. And it's a very, very different way of working that understands that change happens through emotion and contagion, and that it's not all about getting money out of people, because the bigger thing is the slide from previous video about alignment. And if you can get everybody in the Greater Manchester system working towards good lives for all and tackling inequalities, how powerful is that? More powerful than giving us, you know, a grant to run a project.
Yeah, I you know, that latter point I think is a really important factor, isn't it? In the sense of, if we can align all of that investment that's going into those many different influences, or, you know, even just a reasonable proportion of aligning that investment to the movement outcome, or to the good lives outcome, the change is potentially huge, isn't it, compared to what we can get from a single investor that might want to invest in a particular intervention of some way. And I think we struggle with that at times, don't we? If we go back to where we started with the two loops, the dominant system has conditioned us to go and try and find the investment, rather than think about how do we release the potential of what's already being spent, and that, you know, is I think a great thing for people to be pondering.
It isn't. It goes back to metrics, doesn't it? And the system conditions. And I was just sharing about how brilliant it feels, having spent the day yesterday with people from 2 different places around the country, sharing and learning together. And we were reflecting one of the conversations about how with very good intentions, but lots of unintended consequences, active partnerships, for example, were encouraged and encouraged to try and diversify their income going back 10 years. And that led to a whole load of unintended consequences of mission drift and competitiveness and metrics, you know, where you'd have to go to your board to explain what proportion of your income was coming from other sources. And that in itself can lead to very, very transactional ways of working. And it's brilliant. The conditions that are set now with core investment into system partners to play this kind of role, to unlock and align, you know, capacity resource towards uniting the movement's mission is massive shift in not really a very long period of time. And it's hugely exciting. And those of us who have been around in this work for long enough can feel the difference, you know, really feel the difference. It's amazing. So, yeah, and I guess that the link to that is, and this is a translation of it, I guess, into some conversations that Eve and I have been having over probably the last 6 months and with our board about sort of policy and political influencing. And how that also happens, we realise, because we do kind of monthly logs and monthly reflective practice as a team here, and even I focused our kind of monthly logs and reflective practice for a little while on policy and political influencing and trying to just notice what actually makes change happen. And it goes back to that formal and informal Dealey and Stud diagram, is that when you looked at our capture and data and evidence of what we've been doing and how we've been doing it, we realised that there was the stuff that happened in the formal groups that you could see in the visible, you know, the visible box of the revaluation 6-box grid, if you like, that you could point to those formal governance and processes, meetings and boards that everyone can see, and you could put on your, we were kind of laughing about it because you could put that on your PDR, you know, your sort of personal development review to say, well, I went to this many meetings and I put this many papers into this many boards. And then we were also recognising that so much of the change and the shift you really feel, that feels like it holds more potential or it holds different kind of potential, is the little exchange of WhatsApp messages at the end of a day with colleagues, and the stuff that happens in and around the informal conversations and the going for a walk and having a chat and creating space around the formal for the change to happen. And the reason this is really important to the way we work as organisations and as leaders and as practitioners is that it takes you to a whole different conversation about the culture of work and what work even is. Because a lot of what goes on, it's kind of quite private, confidential, sometimes conversations that make change happen because you might be supporting people who are going through a difficult time in their leadership or are trying to, you know, get something through or make some change happen. And so a lot of it is invisible and should be and should remain so. It's legitimate work, but it happens all around the edges. And so for our team, so as Chief Executive of an organisation, what does this help me to kind of reinforce in my messages with the team is that if I see my team out on a walk and a talk and a coffee and a chat with colleagues, I'm going to celebrate that. I am not going to think, what are they doing? That's not real work. They should be at their desk. You know, and where's the output? You know, so I'm looking for very different things. I need them to produce papers and get them in on time for our board meetings, but I also need them to create the space around the work to build relationships with people, and that because I know that's how change happens. And you know, if I go to if members of our team are at a conference or community of practice and learning, etc. I don't want them all to sit together and talk to each other unless they really haven't seen each other for ages. I want them to be intentional about creating the time and space to meet new people and build new relationships, because we know that's how change happens. So yeah, I just think those two things, those two kind of grids there, they complement each other, because that's the way it happens, and that's actually what Jeppe was talking to, is what you need to do. And what you need to do is ask really good questions and listen as well, which is a different kind of way of working. So, and then the final kind of side, I think, of this, this little series is another thing that has really helped us to reassure and to focus and to learn to let go of some things, because, you know, we've talked throughout this about the anxieties and the fears and the loneliness of this and the overwhelm at the scale of what we're trying to do and influence. And, you know, every day this diagram could help me in some way, where I can I ask myself a set of questions, or working with one of the team or somebody in the system or a colleague, about when there's a situation, a conflict situation or a difficult situation or a situation that holds a load of potential, this set of questions of what are we bothered about? You know, what are we either concerned about or interested in? And then within that, what is it that we can influence and how? And then what is it that we are in direct control of? And knowing the difference between those things is really, really important. And that bit at the bottom about, if there's something that we can't control or influence in any moment, we just have to let go of it and be patient, because other things will be at play. So it's not just to let go of it and give up on an idea or give up on, you know, working with that organisation or that part of the system, but it is that, you know, we do need to go where the energy is and go where we can influence and control things. And, you know, in time, this, like we've said before, this is generations plus work. So in time, things come round and things change. So I'll pause there. Any reflections on that before we move into the more personal stuff?
Well, I guess that just looking at this particular slide, it takes us back to the spheres of interest, doesn't it, around the outcome in a way. There's a very similar model here, isn't there, around how we go from what we do to the outcome that we ultimately are looking to try and shift. And so that was, one of the things that was going in going through my head. And then the other bit, I was just starting to think of, just as we're coming to a conclusion of this section, just trying to think of some of the patterns of what I've just heard listening to you around the real importance of relationships and of their network, and the kind of skills, behaviors, qualities that we require to operate well within networks, because we've got so many influences to try and shift. So I think something that's probably we can pick up in the next part around, well, how do you build some of those skills? What does that look like? What does that mean in practice to help people start to operate relationally and through networks? Would you add anything to that for us to?
Well, I would. I'm smiling because it feels like you're interviewing me in this one. And actually, I was only saying to someone the other day about how he was operating a kind of consultancy space, and I was using the way you work as an example of how it's really. I could be interviewing you here, because I think there's nothing wrong with being a consultant. One is what I was saying. There's nothing wrong with being a consultant. And if you work as, we need consultants and expert advisors and a whole range of people around this work. And we work with many of them. And the ones, I suppose, what I would notice in the way that you operate and the way that the best of those people operate is that it is also relational. And just because it could be seen as more commercial. You've got to actually, win work potentially if you're going to go down that route and bidding for work and things like that. But the way you do that is so important as well. And the way that people working in, whether it's private sector, public sector, voluntary community sector, it is all about building relationships and trust and networks. And the way that, I mean, the reason we're doing these videos is because the active partnerships that you're working with are asking for this kind of translation, aren't they? So there's the thing, there's a network of relationships across, 10 or 11 active partnerships, where there's a depth of trust and an honesty and a vulnerability in sharing what we're struggling with, that this hopefully is going to help unlock more of. So yeah, I think it's entirely relevant no matter which part of the system you're working in as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I might ask you about your experiences in the next bit. But we'll kind of pause there and just breathe for a minute before I'll hand back to you, and we can move into mindsets, ways of working and behaviours.
Okay, so we've had a little breath and a cup of tea, and we're now going to explore the how from that whole space that we've just been thinking about, in terms of what influenced our thinking about the way that we needed to practice and lead, and now we're going to try and share some experiences of taking that into our ways of working, the behaviors, just to kind of make it a bit more practical, I guess, in a way, doesn't it? So I'm going to hand over to Hayley first, I think, on the next slide, and then we'll see where we go. Hey,
we'll see where we go. Yeah, so I might go, this is my experience, what's yours? And I think there's probably a longer conversation to have about some of this, but we'll do kind of a bit of a bite-size opening of a door into a conversation about leadership practice, because there's other things to link to as well. This, interestingly, when I do kind of talks or spend time with other places or other organisations, when you've done all of the what and the how and the why and the how do you know what's changing, this is the bit where people are like, what does that take from me? And how do I need to be? And so I think probably what I'll do is I'll skip through these slides quite quickly, and then we can sort of, digest them and then sort of sum up. But I do think it's a longer conversation, this as well, and maybe with some other people. So this early on, 2018, I think it was, we did a small piece of work with you and Andrew Harrison and Andrew Darnton, and we looked at that revaluation model that we talked about in the second video. And it was really early on in my time here, and it was done through storytelling and people explaining how they were doing their work and what seemed to be helping and what seemed to be getting in the way. And it produced, in quite a short amount of time, a really rich set of data about the leadership practice, and we call these the pointers for leadership practice, and they have stood the test of time. Like, we go back to them repeatedly, whenever we're refreshing a document or anything that we're doing, to check that they still kind of make sense. And the only thing that's really, there's a few kind of tiny tweaks, the most significant of which is that have courage used to be brave, and then we realised there was a big difference between courage and bravery, and that's quite important to change. But essentially, behind each of these principles and pointers for leadership practice, there's a list of kind of ingredients, I guess, and it speaks to a lot of what we've talked about in these videos about recognising that the biggest resources are already in the system, and that alignment bit, so that the way you need to work is about bringing people together and convening community practice and learning, and and checking who's not there and giving voice to those voices you can't hear, and engaging people from the very beginning, and co-production and all of that. So this almost, by 2019, this was almost like a guidebook as to how we needed to do the work, and it's been really helpful. And as we've taken this and embedded it into our behaviours in our organisational behaviours, we've gone, what does that mean to us? And what would you see, feel and hear if we were being like this? And I use them a lot. So this is just one of the other ones, an example of around relationships. The great thing about these things is when you call out the behaviour that's not helpful, like finger pointing and blame, or competitiveness, it really jars when you experience it. I'm grateful to say I experience these behaviours less and less over time in our system and in our work. It's really helpful to be able to recognise behaviours and have an evidence base that has been tested that reminds you that these behaviours are not helpful. And they come up in ourselves, don't they? They come up, competitiveness, bubbles up, and then you have to recognise it and notice it and be mindful about the fact that, oh, there's a risk here that I'm becoming competitive, or that my ego is getting in the way of this, whatever, and then do something differently about it. And I think the strengths-based approach we talk about a lot in communities, asset-based community development and strength-based approaches in the community, but equally it's relevant to ourselves as leaders and our teams, you know, focusing on the strengths and building on them rather than focusing on deficits, so growing what is good. So these have just been so important as a kind of handrail for behaviour for us in the work, alongside the recognition that we all play different roles on different days in different ways, different times. It goes back to the lone nut. Sometimes we're the lone nut dancing on the hill, and sometimes we're the cheerleader of another lone nut who's dancing on the hill, and sometimes we're, you know, observing from the balcony and watching all the dancing going on, and all of that is needed. So we're playing many, many roles, and understanding kind of what kind of leadership practice and behaviours are needed to play those roles is important as well. And then through the global community of practice, didn't we discovered these? I'll pass to you for a second to just explain why you think these were important when they came out from Jen and Esther in the global community.
It's not that long ago, is it? Is it 12 months ago that these kind of surfaced for us, and I think that what it really helped me with was that there was this evidence-based kind of approach to the qualities and skills that we need as individuals that are interested in trying to shift complex outcomes. You know, very quickly, the background of this is a group of academics and researchers taking stock of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals after 10 years and realizing that the change hadn't really happened in the most of those goals. So they start to explore why, and their realization was, well, the people that are working on trying to contribute to shifting those goals maybe not have the right skills and qualities for the kind of change that we need to create. And so that you can go on the website for the Inner Development Goals and find all the evidence base that you like, and the continued work at strengthening that evidence base. And this is their current articulation of those skills and qualities. And behind each of these 5 areas, these 5 dimensions, there is a list of skills and qualities that are you can look at, are quite tangible, that you can start to think about. The bit I think that we really loved about it when we first came about it was how acting was number 5, and how, you know, going back to the start of this particular conversation, that 2 loops bit, and how acting is probably the thing that we are encouraged to jump to as quickly as possible. And I just loved the way that this model started to get you to think about being, about thinking, about relating, collaborating, and then getting to acting. And so yeah, it's a really helpful model. And what's nice is, as is often the case in these kind of things, they came up there, and then all of a sudden you start to get glimpses of them elsewhere, and you start to see situations of using them elsewhere. You know, I've introduced these to a number of other active partnership teams in terms of starting to think about your organizational development, and how are you fostering and nurturing these kinds of skills and behaviors in your in the team, and how are you holding people, how can you hold yourselves to account for them, and then how do you start to tell the story of these in your work to partners, and then they pop up in different places, don't they, and you see other people wrestling with them. So yeah, I think it's a really helpful evidence-based way of thinking of the skills and qualities that we need to create the change.
Yeah, interesting, because I've got a session with my coach this afternoon, and I've been doing a bit of what's been going on, what am I thinking about, and I've naturally then used these of describing a situation and then turning them into a set of questions for myself. Is what am I being in this situation? What am I thinking about? Who am I collaborating with? Who am I working with? So they sit really well as well alongside another model that I use with my coach, which is brilliant, called about immunity to change. And that's about my personal immunity to change, as well as our system's immunity to change. And that's, yeah, really interesting kind of way of, I think what's really important is when you've got evidence and models and tools, yeah, you need to work out how to use them in practice. And quite often for me, like the using of them is turning them into questions or turning them into a template that I can kind of scribble alongside. So yeah, I agree. I think they're really great individual and organisational learning and development tools as well. And all of this aligns really nicely to the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership work that's come out of the place-based place partnerships over the last few years. And we've coloured the slides differently. So apologies to Katie Shern because we've turned the slides into GM Newman colour scheme. You know, Katie and the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership explain really well, coming from national evidence base, that if we are integrating physical activity across sectors and strengthening communities and tackling structural inequalities, then we need these kinds of values and mindsets. And I'd love to take all of those words and turn them into sort of a visual and a learning and tool. And I'm sure they're working on this, but that sort of aligns so well to what we learnt in our early work on those leadership pointers for leadership practice with the revaluation approach. There's a mirror, isn't there, in all this to the things that are in here, which is curious and reflective and brave. And so it's helpful in all what I find helpful is the national evaluation and learning, and international actually is in a development goals is all pointing us towards the same kind of behaviours and mindsets. So that feels like it's full of possibility. Anything to say on that one? Because you use that one.
That last point I think is the critical bit. If you were to put the in a development goals, the learning from the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership and those points for practice by the side of each other, you would see an enormous amount of commonality. And I think that's telling, isn't it? And hopeful. And we have a challenge now to start to think about what it means to bring those skills and qualities and behaviours into people, actors across the system. It's not just about our teams and the teams that we work with directly. It's how do we spread the message of these kinds of and then start to think, because it does pose a challenge, doesn't it? In going back to where we still have those kind of quite dominant kind of system organizations that are designed in a certain way that doesn't foster those kind of skills and qualities. That's a space of work that I think we've got quite a bit of learning to do about yet. So maybe that's one of the things for when we start talking about what we want to change in 5 years' time.
Yeah, because it's all very, we know from our system leadership work that you can get people immersed in all of this and start to change their practice, behaviour, values and mindsets. But if they go back into organisations and systems where that's not changing, then that's really hard, and that becomes a very lonely place to be. And that, I think, in all of this ability to get off the dance floor and observe your own behaviour and your own approach, but also your organisations and systems approach and ways of working is important. I'll finish really with, and I think this is where it also opens up into a possible other conversation, is wrapping up really by recognising that we can't be brave in all of this if there aren't safe spaces to work through the struggles and the strife and the fears and the falls. And there's a whole load of stuff that I've certainly learned on this journey about the kind of support that I need to practice in this way, because it can be challenging and it is hugely liberating. And if you can create the conditions for people to work with these values and behaviours, then work can be a hell of a lot of fun and be full of potential. But it is a bit of a bumpy road, which is why I'm meeting my coach later today, because there are bumps in the road, and I think you do need those safe spaces, and there's a follow-on conversation to be had about how we look after ourselves in this work and how we look after our people and our teams and how we help people to do their best work, because that's what people really want to do, isn't it? So I'll let you reflect and wrap us up at that point.
I think probably the best way of wrapping this one up is to just say we've taken the lid off the tin of worms, haven't we? There's a number of things here I think that we probably need to come back to, the story of how those how we did the reevaluation work, and those behaviours that came out of that. It's probably worth unpacking. It's probably worth unpacking, putting the inner development goals, sharing some stories about the different ways of putting the inner development goals into practice is probably worth unpacking as well at some point. And I guess that those are things for us to make notes about in terms of where we might go next, because I think there's a number of things as we've gone through this around where a bit more detail would help, and just people to think about taking it into practice.
Definitely, yeah. And it'd be great if anybody watches this. One person's watched already, so it'd be good to, and we've had some good feedback and some good questions that we can explore as well. But yeah, if anybody is watching this and has got things I'd really like to explore that in more detail, then by all means, yeah, send in your suggestions, because I think we might have a few more to do. And we kind of might be enjoying it.
Yeah, well, it's going to not be quite, summer now, isn't it? Let's just remember that. Let's have a bit of summer now, and then we'll come back to it in the autumn, maybe, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I've had my holiday.
I haven't, so I'm going to have mine. All right, I'm going to have to go.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
See
you
you
later. Bye.
Bye.